She served him like she served everyone else, polite, tired, invisible. He barely spoke, just listened, and when he stood to leave, he left no name, only a folded receipt that weighed more than she could carry. Sometimes the people who save you don't knock. They just notice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning began before the sun had risen. Julia pulled her apron tight around her waist, adjusted her name tag, and stepped into the quiet rhythm of another day. The diner was still half asleep. Chairs barely warm. Windows fogged from the cold outside, and the smell of burnt coffee lingering from the overnight pot. She moved without sound, flipping open the blinds, straightening forks, and pouring the first fresh brew of the morning. Her body had long since memorized the sequence. Her mind, however, was somewhere else. The phone call had come at 5:32 a.m., Emily's nurse. Her daughter's oxygen levels had dropped again overnight. The surgery, already delayed twice, couldn't wait much longer. Julia had tried to keep her voice steady, but the word stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. I'm doing everything I can, she had whispered into the receiver. Please don't cancel Emily's surgery. I'm close. I just need a little more time. Now. She stood by the front register, wiping a coffee mug clean with a dish towel that had seen too many shifts. Her fingers moved mechanically, but her heart dragged behind. Still, she smiled as the door creaked open and the first customer of the day walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, wearing a plain coat and dark sunglasses. He nodded once, slowly, as if recognizing the weight of the hour. No swagger, no entourage, just a quiet presence, and a calm so still it almost changed the air in the room. He chose the corner booth by the window, the one with the chipped formica edge and sun-faded seat. Julia grabbed a menu and walked over. Good morning, she said, voice even and warm. Coffee to start? The man nodded. Black, please. His voice was low but kind, like someone who didn't waste words. She poured the coffee, set it down gently, and walked away. Nothing about him seemed demanding. He didn't check his phone. He didn't ask for anything special. Just sat with his hands wrapped around the cup, eyes tracing the slow movement outside the window. He looked like a man who had once stood in a storm and never forgot what the rain felt like. Julia turned back to the counter, took a breath, and braced for the next hour. She knew better than to hope. Hope had teeth. It came with bills, deadlines, voicemail messages she didn't want to hear. Still, when she took out her wallet to check tips from a night before, her fingers found it, a folded crayon streak drawing on scrap paper. Emily's handwriting curved like the wind. Mommy is my superhero. Julia ran her thumb over the words, then tucked it back inside. No time for tears. Not before the eggs started frying. At 6:45, the man signaled for his order. Nothing fancy. 2 boiled eggs, rye toast, no butter. He thanked her softly. She nodded, surprised at how grounded he seemed, like someone used to being alone without feeling lonely. While the eggs cooked, she leaned against the prep station. Just for a moment, her coworker, Benny, peeked in. You all right? He asked, not unkindly. Julia forced a smile. Just tired. She didn't mention the hospital. Didn't say that the balance due was more than her last 3 paychecks combined. Didn't say that she was 2 rejections away from giving up. She never did. What she didn't know was that the man at the corner booth had overheard fragments of her earlier phone call. Not all of it. Just enough. Enough to catch the name, Emily. Enough to hear the strain in her voice. That sharp inhale between syllables that only came when a parent was begging through clenched teeth. He didn't ask questions. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. Julia brought the plate, refilled the coffee, smiled again. Everything okay? She asked, like she always did. Everything's just fine, he replied. Then he paused, looked at her with an almost imperceptible softness. Thank you for being here. She blinked, taken aback. Of course. He said nothing more. But something about the way he held her gaze for that extra second, not invasive, just honest, made her chest tighten. Not from fear, from recognition, from the quiet understanding that someone had noticed the strength behind her silence. Then he went back to his breakfast. The second wave of customers trickled in around 7:15. Construction workers in dusty boots, a pair of nurses just off night shift, and a mother with a toddler who kept banging a spoon against a table. The diner filled slowly with noise, murmured orders, clinking plates, tired greetings. But the man in the corner booth remained still, quietly sipping his coffee, occasionally glancing up as the morning unfolded around him. He never looked impatient, never signaled for attention. Just watched. Julia moved through the space like muscle memory. Pour, smile, clear, repeat. Her legs ached. But she pushed through it the way she always did. She avoided the clock. Watching it never made time kinder. At one point, she passed by the man's table and noticed he hadn't touched his toast. She paused, keeping her voice light. "Everything all right?" He looked up slowly, as if pulled from somewhere far away. "Perfect. Thank you," he said, then nodded at the window. "I was just thinking. This place is peaceful." Julia smiled politely. "It has its moments." She cleared the next table, but couldn't help glancing back. There was something about the way he sat. Not nervous, not withdrawn. More like someone who had been through something that taught him the value of quiet places. There was weight in his stillness. Not heaviness, but something earned, something lived. Benny passed behind her, nudging her lightly. "Hey, that guy in the corner. He looks kind of familiar, don't you think?" Julia shrugged. A lot of people look familiar before coffee. Benny laughed, moved on, but the thought lingered. Julia tried to place the face. There was something about the jawline, the posture, but her brain was too full. Medical bills. Emily's cough last night. The voicemail she hadn't had the courage to play yet. Near 7:45, the man rose and walked toward the front counter. Julia met him there, receipt already printed, smile rehearsed. "That'll be 7.85, she said, but he was already reaching into his coat. Instead of a wallet, he pulled out a slim, folded note and a card. "Would you mind putting this with the receipt?" he asked quietly, handing both to her. She glanced down. "Sure. Would you like a copy?" "No need," he said, then paused. "And thank you, Julia." Her name on his lips startled her. She hadn't introduced herself. She blinked once, then gave a polite nod, watching as he walked out the door without hurry. No dramatic exit. No turning back. Just a man leaving a diner. She stood still for a moment, holding the folded paper. Something about it felt different. Not romantic. Not transactional. Intentional. A voice interrupted her thought. "You know who that was, right?" Benny leaned over the counter, eyes wide. That was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Julia blinked again. "The governor? Also the Terminator?" he said, mock-offended. "You seriously didn't recognize him?" She shook her head, stunned. He just seemed normal. Benny chuckled. "That's what makes him scary." Julia laughed, but it was short, hollow. Her attention drifted back to the folded note. She opened it slowly. Inside, her name written in neat, heavy strokes. And beneath it, "You reminded me of someone who once gave me everything when I had nothing. This is not a favor. It's a return." Her heart caught. Tucked between the card and the paper was a cashier's check. Julia stared at the number. Not a round figure. Not a showy sum. It was exact. The same amount she still owed the hospital. The number she had whispered into the phone that morning, thinking no one heard. Her hands trembled. She gripped the counter to steady herself. Benny looked over, confused. "You okay?" She tried to answer. The words got lost somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. I think he heard me," she whispered. And with that, the morning rush faded into silence. Not because the diner emptied, but because Julia, for first time in weeks, stood still, not from exhaustion, but from something heavier, holier. Hope. Real. Tangible. Signed and sealed by a man who'd walked out without applause, leaving behind nothing but a folded note and the sound of footsteps disappearing into sunlight. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Orders were taken, refills poured, plates cleared. But for Julia, time no longer moved in minutes or table numbers. It moved in heartbeats. In the feel of that folded note still resting in her apron pocket, her hands carried trays, her feet moved between booths, but her mind kept circling back to that moment. The way he'd said her name, the quiet way of his words, the precision of that number on the check. She didn't tell anyone. Not the other servers, not the manager, not even Benny. Something about it felt too sacred, like if she spoke it out loud, the spell might break. She wanted to hold it a little longer, this fragile sense of being seen, not as a worker, not as a case, but as a whole person, a mother, a fighter, a woman standing in the storm without an umbrella. By the time her break came, Julia sat alone in the back corner of the break room, her lunch untouched. She pulled out the note again, unfolded it slowly, letting her eyes trace the handwriting. You reminded me of someone who once gave me everything when I had nothing. She read it again and again. The words didn't get old. They deepened, took on new meanings with each pass. Who had he meant? A mother? A stranger? Someone like her? She didn't know much about Arnold Schwarzenegger. She had vague memories of action movies playing on the TV when she was a kid, back when the world seemed bigger and simpler. Later, she'd heard he was governor. There were headlines, but she never followed politics much. She was too busy surviving. She didn't know the man, but this version of him, the man who listened quietly, wrote gently, and walked away without needing credit, this version felt real and terrifyingly kind. Her phone buzzed. It was a hospital. Julia's stomach clenched. She stepped outside, found a patch of quiet behind the dumpster where the morning sunlight filtered down in thin lines. Her fingers hesitated, then swiped to answer. Miss Thompson, said the voice, calm and familiar. We received a payment toward Emily's surgery this morning. A cashier's check in full. I just want to confirm that was from you. Julia's mouth opened, but her voice lagged behind. Yes, she said. Yes, it's from me. The nurse sounded relieved. That's wonderful. We'll move forward with pre-op prep. Her chart will be clear for surgery as early as tomorrow. Thank you, Miss Thompson. This will change everything. Julia hung up and stood there in the silence, staring up at the cracked sky. It had changed everything. When she walked back inside, Marcy was near the sink, drying her hands. You good? Marcy asked, not unkindly but with a sharp edge of curiosity. Julia nodded. Yeah, just got some good news. Marcy gave a half smile. Good news? From that booth guy this morning. Julia paused. She hadn't told anyone what happened, but Marcy had seen the man, seen her reaction. He left a note, Julia said, careful, and a check. Marcy's eyebrows lifted. Wait, a tip? Something like that. You serious? Marcy's voice rose slightly. You get random miracles now? Julia didn't answer, not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't have the energy to explain that this wasn't random, that someone had listened when he didn't have to, that someone had remembered what it was like to need help without asking for it, that it wasn't a miracle. It was recognition. She moved back to the floor, tied her apron again, and returned to the register. She didn't float. She didn't glow. She worked, same as before. But now, something had shifted inside her. Not everything was fixed. The rent was still due. The world was still hard. But one door had opened, and maybe that was enough. Later that afternoon, she stood outside the diner on her break, watching the cars go by, her hand brushing against the note in her pocket. The sky was still gray. The wind still bit at her sleeves. But something about the day felt warmer, not because the world had changed, but because someone had remembered how to change it, quietly, precisely, without needing to be seen. The hospital room smelled like lemon cleaner and something faintly metallic. Julia stood beside the window, one hand gripping the strap of her purse, the other resting on the cool windowsill. Emily lay on the hospital bed behind her, small and still beneath a tangle of 4 lines and pastel blankets. A toy giraffe sat tucked beneath the girl's arm, one glass eye chipped, the stuffing around its neck slightly torn. Julia had sewn it up twice already. She'd do it again if she had to. The cashier's check was now in the hands of the billing department. The weight of it, both literal and emotional, had left her fingers hours ago, but the echo of that moment lingered. The moment she'd handed over something that wasn't hers, but had been given with the kind of trust that felt heavier than debt. The clerk hadn't even blinked when she saw the amount, just nodded, typed, and said, "We'll get the surgery confirmed by morning." Julia had nodded too, but her chest hadn't stopped tightening since. She turned now to look at her daughter, who was sleeping peacefully, lips slightly parted, cheeks pale but calm. The monitors beeped steadily. Each sound reminded her that Emily was still here, still fighting. But now, finally, someone had leveled the field. The nurse had told her she could stay the night. She hadn't planned to. She'd packed her lunch for tomorrow, set her alarm for 5 a.m. But now, there was nowhere else she could imagine being. She pulled the chair closer to bed and sat down slowly, her knees aching from standing too long. Her hands rested on her lap, one thumb unconsciously rubbing the callus on the side of the other. She wasn't crying. Not yet. The tears would come later, when Emily woke up, when the surgery was done, when it was all real. The door creaked open. Dr. Ellis stepped in, his white coat slightly wrinkled, stethoscope slung casually around his neck. "Miss Thompson," he said, voice low but warm, "I just wanted to say congratulations and thank you." Julia looked up, confused. "For what?" "For not giving up," he said simply. "Most people in your situation, they're too proud to ask, or too tired to hope. You kept going." She gave a small smile, almost embarrassed. "I didn't have a choice." "Yes, you did," he said, "and you made the right one." He walked over to check Emily's chart, made a few notes, and gave a nod of satisfaction. "We'll prep her early, first on the board. I've already alerted my team." Julia stood slowly, unsure what to say. "Thank you, Doctor. I still don't really understand how this happened." Dr. Ellis paused, turned back to face her. "I don't either," he said. "But sometimes the right person hears the right thing at the right time." He gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, then left the room without another word. Julia sat back down, her heart now caught between awe and disbelief. She reached into her purse and pulled out the note again. The creases were deeper now, the edges soft from being handled too many times. "You reminded me of someone who once gave me everything when I had nothing. This is not a favor. It's a return." She didn't know what Arnold had meant by someone, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had listened, not to a speech, not to a plea, but to a quiet moment that wasn't meant for anyone. And somehow that had been enough. Outside, the sky had turned a soft shade of lavender, the kind that only lasts for a few minutes before dusk sets in. Julia stood again and walked to the window, pressing her palm lightly against the glass. Her reflection stared back. Tired eyes, loose hair, skin pale under hospital lights. But beneath it all, something else, something steadier, a strength she hadn't known anyone could see. But someone had, and they had answered in silence, with a pen and a memory. Behind her, Emily stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips, followed by the smallest word in the world. "Mom." Julia turned instantly, rushing to the bed, taking her daughter's hand in both of hers. "I'm here, baby," she whispered. "And everything's going to be all right now." Emily's eyes blinked open, groggy but warm. "Did it happen?" she asked. "The surgery?" Julia smiled, her voice breaking. "Not yet, but it's coming. And when it does, you're going to be just fine." Emily closed her eyes again. A whisper of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I knew you'd fix it." Julia leaned in and kissed her forehead, holding back the flood behind her eyes. No, she thought. Someone else fixed it. And she would carry that note, not just on paper, but in the way she walked, the way she worked, and the way she raised her daughter. Because when someone lifts you without asking, you don't repay them with thanks. You repay them by lifting someone else. The next morning, Julia arrived early at the diner. Not because she had to, not because anyone expected her, but because habit was harder to break than exhaustion. The sun hadn't yet cleared the rooftops, and the street was still damp from last night's rain. She stood outside the entrance for a moment, watching her own breath fog in the cold, then pushed the door open and stepped into the warmth of burnt toast and old music humming from the kitchen radio. Everything looked the same. The napkin holders, the cracked tile near the coffee machine, the booth by the window where he had sat. But Julia wasn't the same. She moved slowly through the motions, setting up, restocking syrup bottles, wiping down menus. But her mind wasn't tethered to routine anymore. Somewhere inside, a door had opened and wouldn't close again. It wasn't just about the money. It never really had been. It was about what the gesture had said, without needing to be said. That someone saw her. That her effort, her dignity, her silence, none of it had gone unnoticed. Benny walked in 15 minutes later, yawning, his hair still damp from a rushed shower. He gave her a sleepy wave. "You're early." Julia nodded. "Didn't sleep much." Benny grabbed a rag and started wiping the counter. "The news from the hospital good?" She smiled faintly. "Yeah, Emily's surgery is scheduled for noon. Doctor says her vitals are strong." "That's great," he said. "I'm happy for you." Before she could reply, Marcy walked in from the back hallway, purse slung over her shoulder, eyes scanning the dining room like always. She was older than Julia by maybe a decade, sharper around the edges, with a tone that always made you feel like you owed her something. "So," she said, not even pretending to be casual, "you gonna tell us what that guy left you? Or are we all just supposed to guess?" Julia blinked. "Excuse me?" Marcy leaned on the counter, voice low enough to sound like concern, but just loud enough for others to hear. "You know the guy, Arnold whatever his name was. Big secret folded up note. Next thing we know, you're floating around like something magic happened." Julia stiffened, glanced at Benny, who quickly busied himself with the coffee pot. "He left a note," she said carefully. "That's all." "Just a note?" Marcy raised an eyebrow. "Because you look like someone just handed you the keys to heaven." Julia opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no answer she could give that would satisfy curiosity without betraying the dignity of what had happened. Marcy folded her arms. "Look, I'm not trying to be mean. I just think it's funny. I've been here 10 years. Same smile, same hustle. I've served hundreds of customers. You get one quiet guy in a coat, and now suddenly you're getting whatever that was." Julia's voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It just landed, slow and even. "He didn't give me anything I didn't already earn." Marcy blinked. "I didn't ask for it. I didn't expect it. He saw something. That's all." Marcy scoffed. "Please. People like that don't notice people like us." Julia paused, then reached into her apron and pulled out the folded note. She didn't open it, just held it in her palm. "He noticed someone once," she said, "and I reminded him." There was a silence then, not awkward, not angry, just a moment where the air seemed heavier. A customer near the entrance had been listening, an older man in a denim jacket, his hand wrapped around a coffee cup. He stood and said softly, "Some people don't look for the spotlight. They just leave the light where it's needed." Then he walked out. Marcy didn't respond, just looked at Julia for a long second, then turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Julia took a breath and tucked the note away again, her fingers pressing gently along the fold lines. Later that day, when she left early to head to the hospital, no one stopped her. No one asked questions. Benny handed her a small paper bag with a sandwich and a bottle of water. "Tell Emily we're rooting for her," he said. Julia nodded. "Thanks." As she stepped into the afternoon light, her shadow stretched long across the pavement. The wind had softened. The city felt quieter than usual, or maybe she had just stopped drowning in its noise. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The hospital hallway was colder than she remembered. Julia walked with purpose, her shoes echoing softly on the linoleum floor. Her hands gripped the strap of her purse too tightly, and the note was folded inside, pressed between her phone and Emily's favorite drawing. She hadn't opened it again since the morning, but she didn't need to. The words were already stitched into her. Not a favor, a return. It meant more the longer she carried it. Outside the surgery wing, the waiting area was nearly empty. A vending machine hummed quietly in the corner, and a mother with a toddler sat reading a book aloud in whispers. Julia signed in, received a blue paper visitor tag, and sat down in a hard plastic chair that faced the closed double doors. Emily had gone in 15 minutes earlier. The pre-op had been smooth. No tears, just a kiss on the forehead, and the softest promise Julia had ever spoken. I'll be right here when you wake up. She didn't cry, not in the room, not when they wheeled her daughter away, not even when Dr. Ellis squeezed her shoulder and said, "We've got her." But now alone, surrounded by sterile silence and fluorescent light, her breathing slowed, not from panic, but from something heavier, something shaped like waiting. She pulled out the note, unfolded it carefully, and read it again. "You reminded me of someone who once gave me everything when I had nothing. This is not a favor. It's a return." She looked at the handwriting. Steady, thick pen strokes. Not flowery. Just honest. There was no name signed, and none needed. The word said more than any signature could. It wasn't about who gave. It was about why. A nurse walked by, clipboard in hand, nodded politely. Julia nodded back, then tucked the note away and leaned back in the chair. She stared up at the ceiling tiles, one which had a faint water stain in the corner, shaped like a crooked heart. Time bent strangely in places like this. Every second stretched like elastic pulled too far. She thought about the night Emily had been born. 2 weeks early, smaller than expected. She remembered the way her daughter had fit into the crook of her arm, no heavier than a folded blanket. She remembered the nurse saying, "She's a fighter," and she was. That thought carried her through the next half hour, through 3 cups of lukewarm water, through the shuffle of new families checking in, through the urge to call someone anyone, but having no name on her list who would understand what this truly meant. She was halfway through her 4th cup when Dr. Ellis stepped through the doors. Julia stood before he said a word. His smile was quiet but unmistakable. "It went well," he said. "Really well. We were able to stabilize the spinal column and correct the pressure point. She's in recovery now, and you'll be able to see her soon." Julia exhaled, a sound that was part relief, part disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Dr. Ellis nodded. "No need to thank me. You got her here. You kept her here." When he left, she sat back down, covered her mouth with both hands, as if that might keep her heart from falling out. The tears came then, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. They fell in silence, carving lines down her cheeks that only she would ever trace. Eventually, a nurse called her name and led her down the corridor. The recovery room was dim, soft beeping from machines sinking to Emily's breath. Julia walked in slowly, and there she was, her daughter, pale but peaceful, small fingers curled gently around the edge of a blanket. "Hi, baby," Julia whispered, kneeling beside the bed. Emily's eyes fluttered open, heavy with sedation, but her lips moved. "You stayed," she said softly. "Always," Julia answered, brushing hair from her forehead. Emily blinked slowly, and within seconds was asleep again. Julia didn't move. She just sat there, one hand on her daughter's arm, the other in her lap, holding the note one last time before folding it gently and placing it into Emily's pillowcase. Not for her to read, just for her to carry. It had been 3 days since the surgery, and Emily was already asking when she could go home. Her voice was stronger, her appetite was back, and the color had returned to her cheeks like sunlight returning after a long storm. Julia sat beside her bed, peeling the label from a juice bottle, watching her daughter giggle a cartoon on the mounted TV. The hospital room no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a waiting room for something better. That morning, Julia had stepped outside for air. The sky was clear, but the wind bit through her jacket. Across the street, a man in a tan coat was helping an elderly woman step off the curb. No cameras, no audience, just a gesture. Julia watched for a moment longer than necessary. She had become more aware of moments like that now. Quiet things, unnoticed things, the kind that meant more than applause. Back upstairs, she found an envelope waiting at the nurse's station, her name handwritten across the front. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed neatly, with the letterhead of a nonprofit organization. A short message. Dear Ms. Thompson, Mr. Schwarzenegger has asked that we reach out on his behalf. He was moved by your strength and the resilience of your daughter. In addition to covering your recent medical expenses, he would like to offer continued support through a private family grant to ensure Emily has access to post-op therapy and long-term care. He also requests no public attention, no thanks, only that you pay it forward when you're able. Sincerely, Marcus Lowell, Director of Outreach Schwarzenegger Foundation. Julia read it 3 times, then sat down slowly in the chair beside the nurse's desk. The words didn't make her dizzy. They didn't feel unreal. They felt steady, like stone placed quietly beneath your feet, just as the ground starts to give way. She didn't cry. She smiled. The next weekend, Arnold appeared on a local news broadcast. Not as a guest, not with headlines, just a clip. He was speaking at a youth event in Fresno, talking to teenagers about self-discipline, about community, about how the strongest people he ever met weren't in Hollywood or politics. They were janitors, veterans, nurses, mothers who worked double shifts and still came home to help with homework. Julia watched the segment with the volume low. She didn't need to hear every word. She heard the meaning. She heard herself in between the lines. Not by name, not by detail, just by presence. Later that night, Emily had fallen asleep early. The nurses dimmed the lights. Julia stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the wall. She took out her phone, opened a blank message, and typed, "I never got to say thank you, and I know you asked me not to, so instead, I'll just say this. I see what you did. Not just the money, the choice, the timing, the listening. You gave us more than a chance. You gave us the strength to believe again. I will never forget that. I promise I'll pass it on." She didn't hit send. There was no number to send it to. And maybe that was the point. She saved it as a draft and let it sit there. By the time Emily was discharged, spring had started to bloom. The air felt different, not softer, but cleaner. Julia pushed the wheelchair out of the hospital doors, one hand on the handle, the other resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. Emily turned her face to the sun and smiled so wide it made Julia stop walking. "Feels good," the girl said. "Yeah," Julia whispered. "It really does." They reached the car, buckled in, started the engine. But before pulling away, Julia looked up into the rearview mirror and whispered something she hadn't said in a long time. "Thank you, whoever you are." A few days later, back at the diner, life moved on. Coffee brewed. Orders were taken. Tables cleaned. Marcy didn't ask questions anymore. Benny left an extra croissant by Julia's register. And the booth by the window? It stayed empty most mornings. But sometimes, when the light hit it just right, Julia found herself glancing over, half expecting to see that familiar silhouette. She never did, but that didn't matter, because some people don't show up to be remembered. They show up to remind you of who you are, and then they quietly leave the world just a little more whole than they found it.